Today we're checking in with Erin Summe from the class of 2004, whose career has taken her from New York City to South Africa to London and back again. Erin is currently the Director of Global Business Development at Intrinsic Exchange Group, a company that is launching a new asset class based on the value and productivity of nature. She is also the founder of Tandeka Travel, a company that leads meaningful experiences throughout Africa. We are so looking forward to hearing about how all these things intersect. Erin, welcome.
Thanks for having me.
So last week was Climate Week in New York, and I saw a bunch of buzz about you speaking at the IUCN event. Can you share with us the work that you're doing at Intrinsic Exchange Group?
Sure. So at Intrinsic Exchange Group, we recognize that the current environmental problem we're facing today is on a capital market scale. And so we recognized we needed a capital markets size solution. So what we're doing at Intrinsic Exchange Group is largely recognizing that in addition to our industrial economy, we have an entirely other natural economy that is highly productive through its natural assets and the work that they produce, which are called ecosystem services. Yet none of this productivity is incorporated into our traditional metrics of growth or GDP. So our idea was that we could start to incorporate this productivity in goods and services so that we could focus on the restoration of ecological services that would render benefits for everybody across the globe.
So you're saying if we could invest in the restoration of ecological services, that would actually be beneficial financially and sustainably for humans and nature. How do you go about doing that?
So the way that we do that is Intrinsic Exchange Group engages with large landholders. This could be on the public side with a government or a private side, which could be a corporation and a large underlying supply chain that they have, mostly based in agriculture, or a group of individuals. What we'll do is we'll define the boundaries around this landscape, and within it, we'll identify what work is nature generating here. So within our company, we've identified 38 different ecosystem services, which is largely in line with what the UN have put out for their environmental economic accounting framework. These ecosystem services include capturing carbon, storing water, purifying water, mitigating floods, mitigating fires, pollination, climate regulation, wildlife habitats, soil retention, amongst others. We will bring in a third-party firm that works within an industry called Ecosystem Service Valuation. This is an industry that's existed for over 20 years with the job of putting a financial value on natural assets and the ecosystem services that they produce. This industry mostly works behind the scenes with governments, insurance companies, corporations. They'll look at the trade-offs and pros and cons around different public projects, the difference between gray infrastructure and green infrastructure. They'll look at insurance companies at what's the value at risk of different natural assets and landscapes. They'll work with man-made disasters and the damages that are the consequences of that. So if there's an oil spill, they'll determine the fines that are ultimately going to get paid for damaging that coral reef or destroying that mangrove forest. And we as a public see these fines, but we don't really ask the question, how did they put a price on that coral reef or that pelican species that's now endangered? And this is a group of environmental economists who have a job of putting a financial value on these natural assets. And depending on the ecosystem service that they want to measure, they'll implement a certain methodology. The primary methodology they would use would be replacement costs. So if this mangrove forest weren't here, what would we have to pay to artificially create something with similar functionality? And so they would look at what all the mangrove forest produces. It is creating storm surge protection, it's capturing large amounts of carbon, and it's serving as a nursery for new fish and bird species. So while we don't have market prices for all of these goods, there are prices available of what those alternatives would be that we would have to pay for if nature wasn't naturally producing this.
Okay, so you have the evaluation. What happens next?
So once we've brought in the ecosystem service valuation firm, they'll identify which of the different 38 ecosystem services are generated within this landscape, what's the annual production per year, and financially, what is that worth? We'll look at that similarly to an analyst, the way an analyst would look at a discounted cash flow. If we can determine this is the financial value produced on an annual basis, we can project that out over 50 years or 100 years and discount it back to get the net present value of the natural assets generating this work. Once we've determined that value, our company creates a new form of corporation called a natural asset company. This natural asset company obtains the rights to all 38 ecosystem services produced on that landscape. Doesn't mean that it needs to own the land, but it is granted the rights to all of the productivity happening on it. That can be structured similarly to a carbon right, an air right, timber right, mineral right, things that we're very comfortable structuring today. Those are granted into the natural asset company by whoever owns the land, whether that be a government or a private company. They do this in exchange for a majority equity share of the natural asset company. We then have a partnership with the New York Stock Exchange, and today on the big board is a section dedicated to natural asset companies. This section will be governed according to its own rules of what is a natural asset company, what is its purpose, what can and cannot it do. We will be taking these companies public via IPO on this part of the exchange. The proceeds from the IPO can only be used to reinvest into the ecosystem in a way that restores, manages, protects, or grows the underlying natural capital. So if we look at the value of the natural asset company at IPO, it's going to be based on the annual production of ecosystem services it's currently producing. After the IPO, and we have the proceeds that are generated from that, whether it be $100 or $200 million, that funding will be deployed by a management team set to run the natural asset company and invested in a way that will improve the quality of the underlying natural assets, which should lead to an increase in the amount of ecosystem services it's able to produce per year. So if we look at the value of the company, which is based on the productivity, and we now have the proper funding to restore that land or marinescape, we should see a capital appreciation in the value of the company as those underlying assets become more productive. And on the accounting side, some of these ecosystem services today generate cash flow, including carbon capture, provisioning of fresh water, ecotourism. That part of the natural asset company will be accounted for in traditional GAAP or IFRS accounting. What we've done is we've created an additional accounting framework called Statements of Ecological Performance, which will create the framework for all of those ecosystem services that are not currently monetized today. So when looking at the overall value of the natural asset company, it will include both those traditional cash flow generating ecosystem services for which we have the metrics of measuring, in addition to the statements of ecological performance.
So, Erin, do these natural companies have to have cash flow?
There will be, of the ecosystem services that are generating cash flows, those will be incorporated into the company. For the ecosystem services that don't generate cash flow, we've stepped back and really looked at the origins of money and of cash. And cash is currently a means of an exchange, and money is largely tradable debt. So when looking at a natural asset company, if we can create a common playbook so that people are looking at the same things in the same way and determining in a similar fashion what's going to drive that change in value going forward, we can capture the current value of production of these ecosystem services, come to a consensus of what they're worth, and then track those value drivers going forward and how that value will change. So we can incorporate the ecosystem services that do generate cash today in addition to those that don't, as long as we're all looking at a consistent and transparent framework to measure what those are.
So this sounds like incredibly important work, and thank you for the overview. I feel like I just got a crash course in natural asset companies and what you do at Intrinsic Exchange Group. How did you get here? What were the large influences or people who affected your career trajectory to get you where you are now, making such a big impact in the world?
Sure. Well, it's certainly been a winding road. I had started off my career in finance, so had spent about 5 years at Morgan Stanley. I'd moved to South Africa, spent 3 years with grassroots soccer, working in HIV prevention in the townships there, had gone on to London Business School to study business, founded Tandeka Travel, which is a purpose-driven, high-end travel company throughout Africa, and then ended up at Intrinsic Exchange Group. And when I look at what's led this journey, and while it seems a bit disjointed, I've always sought to understand the world so that I could find different ways that it could engage to change it. And I wanted to look at what were the driving forces. That was certainly capital markets. So I wanted that to be a language I understood. And then when it came to impact, I knew that no matter how much I read or studied, I'd never really understand the struggles of those that face poverty on a daily basis. So to be able to spend those years, the privilege of spending those years with those on the front line of a lot of those issues was really the education of my life. And through our work at Intrinsic Exchange Group, it really brings all of these different assets together, right? Of there is a way where we can employ the power of finance and we can incorporate the value of nature. And we can do that in a way where we're engaging with local communities that are ultimately the stewards of most of these natural assets. If we look at valuable landscapes around the world, including rainforests, and they can be the main and primary beneficiaries of these new natural asset companies. So for me, this was really where all of these elements came together.
So I want to ask more about Tandeka Travel, but first, can you share where the name of your company came from?
Sure. Tandeka means loved one in Xhosa, which is a South African language. So when I had started working for grassroots soccer, a woman named Mums that runs the center there, I'd introduced myself as Erin, and she said, "No, you're Tandeka, one driven by love, and may it ever guide you forward." And it has.
Yeah, I love that story. Thank you for sharing. So Tandeka Travel, you have had a lot of time spent with some of these communities who, as you mentioned, are some of the stakeholders in natural assets. What have you learned, and why did you build this company in the first place? What was the mission originally?
The mission was having spent a lot of time on the ground with communities that were struggling with HIV, general public health, water, education. I knew that they were the ones that had the information and insights that were ultimately going to be the ones that could craft the solution. And these are people that are generally not heard. So I wanted to create a platform where we could bring people with resources into parts of the world they typically wouldn't go, so that we could have dialogues and engagements where we could genuinely share with each other what we've both struggled with. And if you remove the context of people's lives, whether they're wealthy or not, we all face the same emotions. We all want to be loved. We don't want to feel rejection or hurt or like a loser. And these are the same emotions no matter where you live. And I thought if we could find a way to make it fun through food, sport, and music for these different worlds to connect, both sides would get a lot out of it, and we could hopefully channel resources to parts of the world that could put it to very good use.
So there was a little hiatus during the last couple of years where trips didn't happen, but are they back on?
The trips are back on. So as you can imagine, I spent 4 years of sweat, blood, and tears building this company. And then, guys, COVID came up, and I thought, well, shoot, this doesn't look good. And we were able to survive that period and put the company was dormant for a while. And now it is back up and running, leading purposeful trips throughout the continent. And we're incredibly excited about it. And we've had quite a bit of nobles engagement from families and faculty who have always been so incredibly supportive.
Where to next? What are the upcoming trips this year?
For this year, we have quite a few people going to South Africa, which is exciting. And they get the safari experience, they get the engagement within the different townships, whether that be Kailicha or Soweto. And it seems to be the first stop on a lot of people's lists. I would say South Africa or Kenya, both are which are dramatically beautiful, and people feel so welcomed by the communities there as well.
So, Erin, zooming back out a little bit, and thank you for explaining some of the work with Tandeka, but you've spent sort of equal parts with in finance and in impact with communities on the ground. Can you tell us about that decision and sort of how you see that, the importance of that, especially as, in 2022, we're sort of looking ahead towards different types of solutions. What is your personal view on the importance of having both backgrounds?
I think that there's been actually really helpful awakening through COVID, and we've done a bit of an assessment of what is good business, and we've started to incorporate some really powerful value drivers like our impact on the environment and our impact of people. And for me, a good business is one that takes good care of their people and they do things in a sustainable way. And I think that's largely now becoming the norm, and we've had a bit of time to pause and think about that. And when I had worked in finance, I saw an incredible amount of resources and intellectual property there, but people, to some extent, were always searching for meaning, to wake up in the day and feel like they've made the world a little bit of a better place, whatever that looks like. And on the other side, working in impact, I saw an incredible amount of purpose, but parts of the world that could use those resources. So fortunately, I think that these different industries are starting to become more aligned, and I think both parties can very much win because of that. And I'm very optimistic person, and the word that's quoted is a possibilist, where optimistic sometimes seems naive, but I'm a possibilist, so I know and believe what's possible. And I think these win-win scenarios out there where people can invest well, they can make money, they can be profitable by including more stakeholders in that equation. And I certainly think it's more sustainable in the long run. And it's a lot more fun to build businesses that way.
Yeah, I love that, a possibilist. So as a possibilist, is there anything that keeps you up at night? What sort of worries you? What would you, if you could wave your magic wand, what would you change about people's perspectives?
I think what keeps me up is that a lot of people feel as though the problem is so big and it's so insurmountable that their individual actions don't matter. And I think they do. So whether it's trying to reduce your energy usage or moving to a different kind of car or making the effort to recycle, it's not just those actions and the impact that they have, but it's the messaging that you're sending to your friends, to your family, to your business, to your children about what's important to you. And I think those become very self-reinforcing, and those attitudes spread. And as businesses become more and more aware that this is what's important to individuals, we're going to start seeing that corporate behavior changing as well. So I would love for individuals to feel more empowered around the change, and nothing is silly and nothing is insignificant. And I think we're all a lot more powerful than we give ourselves credit for.
Yeah. And so, Erin, I want to end with a question. We talked a little bit about this before, but in your work, and especially for anyone who receives your emails or has had the opportunity to look through your absolutely stunning images in the book that you published a few years ago, you have such a unique perspective on the world and on nature. And through your written word and your images, how do you see the world? If you can share that quote that you shared with me before, I think that would be a great way to end.
Sure. The quote that I love, it talks about why people write books. And more or less, it's saying to the reader, here's my soul. Here's the way I see the world. Here's the way I'm treated. Is this the way you're treated too? And I think it's impossible to truly put ourselves in other people's shoes. But the closest we can get is to read those novels, to hear those perspectives, to read how differently people feel in different situations and how vastly different it is from our own. People's struggles and also people's joys. And I find that those insights can be best captured through writing and also through images. So as a photographer, when you see that vulnerable, raw moment and you can capture it on film, it takes the story that much further in making it come alive of that emotion that person has. And I think I'm always surprised whenever I read a personal narrative, and we can put on such a different face in public when we're feeling something so different internally. And just to be able to recognize that what we're going through, most other people are going through too, and what we're struggling with, others have struggled with before us and will after us. And there's something empowering and unifying about that, which I love.
Well, Erin, thank you so much for taking a few minutes to share your perspective with us. And thanks to everyone who's listening.
Thank you so much for having me. And big thank you to the Nobles community, who remains a really important part of my life. A big thank you to the Nobles community, who remains a really important part of my life.